even if some people in Washington say this is not our war, it is seen as an American war around the world in places where it really matters for the US. And a Russian victory in Ukraine now would be seen as an American defeat in East Asia, in the Middle East, and would really make America's position untenable in those other areas where people that oppose aid to Ukraine say they care about, like Taiwan. We are now in the age of an increasingly globalized conflict in which this sort of axis of authoritarian regimes are working increasingly together to undermine the Western-led democratic order and to discredit it and to challenge it.
Hello and welcome to the pod, and it's my great pleasure to speak with Yaroslav Trofimov, Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent of the Wall Street Journal and a native of Ukraine, who has written Our Enemies Will Vanish, which is an account of the first year of the war against Russia. In this chat, we talk about the impact on Ukrainians, the threat posed by Russia and what it means globally, and the potential impact of the US elections in November, as well as many other facets of the conflict. I should mention that we recorded the chat prior to the news that Zelensky was planning to sack his chief of the armed forces, which seems now to have not happened, but there's more to come on that story. A quick reminder that we have our new sister podcast, Spy Masters, as Antonia talks to ex-CIA analyst and spy novelist David McCloskey. Coming up, I'm speaking with Louis Sarkozy on Napoleon Bonaparte. I've got the Mau Mau uprising, the history of the mafia, and much, much more. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends, and if you can give me a 5-star rating, you'll be forever in my heart. But until then, I'm going to hand you over to me and Yaroslav talking the war in Ukraine. Yaroslav Trofimov, welcome to the podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's excellent to be on the show.
Well, I've really been enjoying this, but well, I suppose enjoying is not quite the right word, actually. It's just such a compelling read, and I've been racing through it. It's written in such a style that it makes you just want to turn each page. But as I kind of alluded to just now, this sort of almost a mounting horror as we're dealing with this horrific conflict. And so I guess my first question I wanted to ask really was around, I mean, the title, Our Enemies Will Vanish, does imply this is certainly personal for you, isn't it?
Well, the title has a history. It's one of the sentences in the Ukrainian national anthem, which was written all the way back in the 1860s, when the whole idea of a Ukrainian state seemed like an unachievable dream. And yet again and again, Ukraine has risen from the ashes and proved that it does exist. It's not a figment of imagination, as some people in Russia say, and it is an actual country that fights for its existence. And the line goes on saying, our enemies will vanish like dew at sunrise, which is a very optimistic image. It's not like in the Marseillaise where, your enemies lie in the pool of blood. And again and again, people kept repeating this line to me during this first year of the war, which sort of became almost like a greeting, an expression of hope and a belief, like a steadfast belief in a victory that will come.
Well, that's the kind of feeling I got from when reading the book and when you're encountering all sorts of different people throughout the front lines that you're reporting from and you're writing about. There is this kind of undercurrent of determination. That's the sense I got. Is that right? Not only fight, but defeat the invader.
Yeah, and I think, when the war began, there was a couple of days of doubt and of chaos, if you will. People were coming to terms with the fact that the unthinkable has happened. And by the end of the second day of the war, there are always rumors spread by the Russians that President Zelensky had fled. He's in Poland. He is in Europe. So that evening he came out and recorded this video that he put on YouTube saying, we are here. Everybody is here. Nobody is fled. And he showed out he's on the main square and we will be here. And I think that really was a moment when everything coalesced together. And I remember driving through Kiev the next morning, and there were, thousands of people coming out of their homes, of the high rises, and lining up the stadium to pick up weapons and to go and fight. And I think there was this quiet feeling of how dare they? How dare they come and attack us? But also a belief that there is no way that Russia will be able to win. And I think Ukrainians realize that Russia is a much bigger country and perhaps a stronger country in some ways. But it's not immensely larger. So Ukraine, it's Russia is about 3 times larger than Ukraine in terms of population. So it's not as skewed as to make the battle impossible in terms of resources. And the determination of Ukrainians obviously played a huge role in rolling back the Russian advances.
Well, I mean, that's the extraordinary thing to me, certainly reading the book as well, is that if there was ever any doubt that, I mean, not that there should have been, but if there was, I guess, doubt in Russia that Ukraine is not a sort of, a sovereign country, it's the will that was shown by the people to fight. But I just wanted to ask about those first few days, particularly in Kiev, which she writes about. It just feels just off the page, it's like such a weird, strange time, because there are these supposed Russian special forces looking to go into Kiev and find Zelensky to presumably kill him or kidnap him. I don't know, but what was it like those first few days in Kiev?
Well, the night before, everything was almost normal. I remember going through Kiev to see the former Ukrainian president Poroshenko in his office, sort of in the late afternoon of February 23rd. And we had an interview. And then he leaned towards me and almost whispered in my ear, the war will be tomorrow morning at the crack of dawn. If you want to get out of here, you still have time to go to the airport to catch one of the final flights. Then I remember walking back with this knowledge and looking at the city, people still partying, restaurants full, shopping malls busy, traffic in the streets. And all that sort of died towards the evening as the word spread. And Zelensky went on TV with a speech saying, we don't want war. And I'm addressing the Russian people, and he spoke in Russian. If you will come, you will see our faces, not our backs. We will fight you. And then the war began. I went to bed with my windows open because I wanted to hear when it starts. And it did start roughly after 4 a.m. And what happened that morning is that the Russians landed helicopter-borne troops on the Gostomel airfield just outside of the city. And there was the pivotal element of their invasion plan. What they wanted to do is to take over this airfield and then use it to land there many thousands more of the best troops, the VDV, the airborne troops, with their armored vehicles, to then have this major thrust into the city of Kiev. And in that they failed. They managed to seize the airport after a long battle with the defenders, after losing a large number of their helicopters. But by then, reinforcements came in, Ukrainian artillery came in, they pounded the landing strip, and none of the Russian aircraft that were flying towards Ukraine actually dared to attempt a landing. And so the Russian force in the airfield remained small, and this thrust into Kiev, which was basically defenseless at the time, didn't happen. And by the next day, as I said, the arms were giving away, and the population came in, and defenders just gathered by the thousands, and then everybody rallied. The police, the firefighters, you name it, because the regular troops in the Kiev area were quite limited at the time. But one brigade was in the Kiev region, with much of the rest of the military out east in the Donbass. And so in this early hours of the war, there was a panic to an extent. I mean, a lot of people were getting the families out. So the typical behavior was there would be a family, and so usually the wife or the spouse and the children, and maybe the elderly parents would be brought out to Western Ukraine to safety, relative safety, and then fighting age men would come back, pick up arms a day or two later, and fight. At the same time, there were many Ukrainian men outside the country, from seasonal workers, working construction in places like Croatia, to some of the richest people in the country. One of the characters in the book is, a multimillionaire who was one of 100 top business people in Ukraine with a large, agricultural and food company. So he was skiing in Austria when the war began. He dropped everything and he rushed back to Kharkiv when he helped organize the resistance, and even set up his own battalion that then became a brigade. So, and he had lots of examples like this of people abandoning the good lives they had elsewhere in safety and coming back to fight for their country.
Yeah, it is incredible reading about that. It really is. Also, Sean Penn makes quite a few appearances in the early part of the book, which I was quite impressed. He remained in Kiev for as long as he did. Not that that's just a bit of light relief in the early part of the book.
Yeah, I think. Well, he remained for the one day of the invasion, and he was. I mean, when our hotel emptied out on the eve of the invasion, it was me and my colleague, and he and his team were the only ones left in the lobby drinking Negronis and watching as Zelensky made his last peacetime television address. And Kiev was in a tough position for the first 3 weeks. It was surrounded from three sides. The Russians were trying to push forward and cut off the last remaining highway south to Odessa. They were stuck on the western side of the Irpin River, which sort of bounds Kiev in the west, trying to cross it and come into the city. This is where the toughest battles occurred, including the town of Bucha, where the Russians massacred more than 400 Ukrainian civilians. And it was touch and go for a little bit. But at the end of the day, what the Russians didn't realize is that the Ukrainians will resist. And here we go back to the perceptions of Ukraine. President Putin wrote this famous letter, an essay on the historical unity of Ukrainians and Russians in the summer of 2021, and he had it read out to every member of Russian armed forces, in which he said the Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and it's this Western imposed clique that is prying us away, sort of trying to pry us apart and leading Ukraine astray. And I think many people in Russia, including possibly him, really believe that this is true, and that when push comes to shove, the vast majority of Ukrainian soldiers will switch sides. And Putin himself publicly appealed on day 2 of the war to Ukrainian troops to turn their weapons against this band of drug addicts and corrupt, traitors in Kiev and side with the Russians.
And Nazis.
And Nazis, yes. Well, I mean, in Russia, everybody who is against Russian occupation is a Nazi by definition, I think. It's a term that's used very loosely.
You've mentioned the impact on civilians that the Russians have carried out these horrific crimes. And I wondered, that must be the most difficult part of your reporting, to have to see something like this. I mean, you are a renowned foreign affairs correspondent, so I guess this kind of thing isn't unheard of in your experience, but I guess to see your own countrymen and women and children being treated in such a fashion, I just wonder, it must be a horrific experience for you, and then you're having to file reports as well as write this book.
Yeah, obviously, it's different when you cover a war in your own country, in an attack on the city where you grew up, where you have so many memories linked to every street, every corner of the city center, the botanical gardens, the St. Sophia Cathedral, and then you see this emptied out of people with anti-tank barriers and smoke from bombs and the thought of explosions. Obviously, if you take it as a personal insult, as an invasion of your own private space in a way, not just as a political issue. Yes, covering all these atrocities is more difficult when you understand every little nuance of it. When there is no cultural filter, because no matter how much empathy we may have, or I may have, and we all do in other wars, it's not like we don't feel for Afghans or Iraqis or other Palestinians. But obviously, being not from there, you don't understand everything, and you don't really relate in your bones to everything that happens. But we also, covering wars, you were trained to put this filter in front of you and to be able to sort of detach yourself emotionally, because you have a mission to do. You have to be there almost like a camera, to record what's happening, to process the information, then to get out of there while it's, before you're shot yourself or shelled. And so sometimes you just think about it later. Sort of, you do your job and then you process your feelings at leisure. And writing a book like this actually helps, because the book is, I'm trying to steer clear of, me and what I think and what I am. But of course, you have to, because I am the narrator there. And I allow myself sometimes to bring myself into the narrative, though I try as much as possible to just be there as the reader's eyes, and to tell the story through other characters throughout the lives, who are frankly more important than me and did much more than me in that war.
Reading about the fighting throughout 2022 and fighting off the Russians and that successful defense of much of Ukraine, I wondered what your view was of the support from the West, which, we're speaking at a time where we've got a US election, and this is going to be a part of that election. And we've got, potentially Trump, who doesn't seem to be interested in providing support to Ukraine. There are difficulties with that now. But if one looks at 2022 and then to 2023, maybe there's some lack of air support during the Ukrainian offensive. If you look at the war up to now, what do you feel the view of Ukrainians is of support from the West?
Well, I think overall, there was never enough. And when it came, it was always too little too late. And that happened for different reasons at different stages of the war. If you look at the very beginning of the war, or before the war, I remember being in Kabul in August 2021. I saw how the Taliban walked in pretty much unopposed into the city. And then the rest of the world saw the scenes of them driving around in American Humvees, in American AMRAPs, even flying a Black Hawk that the Americans had left behind over Kabul. And I think the lesson drawn from this by the US's allies was, especially as they expected Ukraine to collapse within 3 days, was what's the point of giving them weapons? And so when Ukraine was asking for weapons before the war, all they got was a box of javelins from the US. They got 90 Javelin anti-tank missiles. That's all the US would give the Ukrainians. The British were more generous, and Prime Minister Johnson had kind of exerted pressure on his sort of military procurement people, and the UK had provided about 2,000 NLAW missiles, which were up to a point quite useful. But overall, everyone expected the Ukrainian military to collapse, and all this weaponry was a weaponry really for a future guerrilla war, kind of like Afghanistan in the 1980s. Anti-tank weapons, some Stingers, have fun fighting the Russians for the next 20 years. Then the war itself began. And the first thing that Putin did in his declaration of the so-called special military operation was also to issue a warning. He said, if you interfere with my special military operation, you will see the consequences, the likes of which you have never seen, which was, a nuclear threat. And again, that worked. So, when Poland wanted to give MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine in the first weeks of the war, the US vetoed it, saying it's too provocative. And then there were no supplies of Western heavy weapons, no supplies of Western artillery for several months. It's only in the summer of 2022, when Ukraine already defeated Russia around Kiev and was now facing a new phase of the war in Donbass, and running out of its Soviet, it used up pretty much all of its Soviet standard ammunition, that then Western artillery started to come in. Initially in limited numbers. And again, at that time, the Ukrainians asked for more, and they said, well, okay, but we also need tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, APCs, aircraft, Patriot air defenses. And they came up with a list of what they needed. And that was laughed off. It was said, it's outlandish. How can we give them so much? And it will cross all the Russian red lines. And so when Ukraine, and also, the saying was, okay, well, you managed to sort of did okay around Kiev, but there's no way you can carry out offensive operations of your own. And when Ukraine proved them wrong, and when Ukraine actually very successfully routed the Russian army in the east near Kharkiv in September 2022 and started pressing in Kherson, Putin made another threat. He announced the annexation of this Russian region. He announced the annexation of these 4 Ukrainian regions and said, "This is now Russia. The rules have changed, and we will defend them with every weapon in our disposal. Quote unquote, this is not a bluff." And again, this caused a lot of consternation, high-level talks, fear of use of nuclear weapons, and it throttled support for Ukraine at this critical juncture. Ukraine called a bluff and went ahead and did take the city of Kherson, which is the capital of one of its 4 regions, and did take city of Liman in Donbass. But by then, it had run out of weapons to keep pressing. And at the same time, at that time, Russia was at its weakest. Russia only had about 100,000 combat troops left in Ukraine after all these losses of the previous month. And for political reasons, Putin, until that point, was refusing to mobilize additional troops. So Ukraine had a manpower advantage in the battlefield. What they didn't have was weapons. So it had to stop. What happened afterwards? Russia mobilized several 100,000 troops, filled the front line, spent the winter building fortifications, laying minefields, and the US and the West changed their mind. So all of a sudden, tanks were okay now. Patriots were okay. Everything Ukraine was asking for a year earlier was pretty much delivered in the spring and summer of 2023, except for fighter jets, which are still in the pipeline. But by then it was too late. By then, the nature of the war changed so much that this was no longer enough. And the historical opportunity that Ukraine had in the summer and autumn of 2022 was lost.
We've been interviewing a number of historians and academics who often looking at trying to find some kind of historical similarity in the conflict, see if there are any echoes or something to learn from. Is there a historical perspective you have that you think might be useful in viewing the war in Ukraine? For example, I know a number have talked about First World War, 1916, around, we're in a conflict where defensive strategy and tactics seem to be quite effective.
I think I'd compare it in different ways to 2 conflicts. I mean, I think the one that comes to mind, first of all, was the Russian war, the Soviet war in Finland in 1939, where, again, the Soviets thought that they could very quickly take over the entire country. I mean, they had just by threats of using force, extinguished the independence of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and they thought that Finland would be kind of the same. And they proclaimed already the creation of the Finnish Soviet Socialist Republic, and then in the battlefield, they actually didn't achieve their goals. They were stuck in a bloody war against a tiny country. Finland at the time had only 3 million people. And the Soviets at the time, sent the force that was about 5 times larger than the force that sent to Ukraine. And at the end of the day, Finland had to accept territorial losses to sue for peace. But it showed that resistance to this vastly superior, on paper at least, power is possible and worthwhile. Because if Finland had not resisted, it would have lost everything, as opposed to parts of its territory. And I think the Ukrainians really were inspired by that Finnish resistance. And before the war, people kept talking about it, we have to fight because at least that way we keep at least something. We may lose Donbass, we may lose, Crimea, we may lose the South, but if we don't fight, we'll lose everything for generations. And yeah, I think the parallel with the First World War is that at the end of the day, it was a contest about the resilience of societies. I mean, what broke first Russia and then Germany was not what was happening necessarily at the front line. It's what was happening at home. And, the economy, but also faith in victory, in Russia's case, also massive casualties, soldiers refusing to fight. And I think it's very much applicable to Ukraine and Russia now, because if you look at the front line, It hasn't really budged since November 2022, since the seizure of Kherson. I mean, the Russians took Bakhmut after a long battle, but other than that, the small town, nothing else has really changed hands. But there is still massive casualties every day. There is fighting every day. Hundreds die every day. Resources get expended. And there is tension in both societies. We saw tension within Russia manifest itself during the Prigozhin uprising last year. There's certain tension within Ukraine. We haven't seen cracks on the surface, but it is taking its toll in Ukrainian society. And so kind of in the future, I think the society that remains more resilient will be the one that emerges victorious. And how resilient Ukraine is also a function of continuing Western support. And as you mentioned, American money has run out for now. Many Republicans in Congress don't want to fund Ukraine anymore. Let's see if there are many who do. So not the entire Republican Party is opposed, but right now, aid to Ukraine has been stuck in internal American politics and the debate about the border, etc. And so in Europe as well, while many countries want to spend more, countries like Hungary have been trying to obstruct European aid to Ukraine. And we'll already see the consequences of this. In the battlefield, for sure, because Ukraine is running out of ammunition again. And that is allowing the Russians to keep trying to advance so far without any notable successes. But the initiative now is again in Russian hands.
It's interesting what you say there. I mean, the moment the invasion began on the 24th of February, I think many people, I mean, certainly my feeling was that this is an existential fight. And that's the belief of many people here in Britain and in America as well. And I know, writing for the Wall Street Journal, you are tuned into that side of, American domestic politics. We have Biden, who's in support of Ukraine. If Trump were to win the election, if one looks at his previous administration, where he had a number of, a good way of describing it, maybe sort of calmer heads, as it were, who were able to steer him in certain areas to take maybe a more sensible approach to foreign affairs. Is this something that is likely to happen again if Trump were to win, that there would be senior foreign affairs officials who could influence him to really change his view of what he's going to do with Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll go back first to the beginning of what you said. I think when the war began, when the full-fledged invasion began, because the war began in 2014, but when the full-fledged invasion began in 2022, it was existential for Ukraine, but it was not existential for the West. The US had shut down its embassy, withdrew its diplomats and personnel, so did the UK, and a Russian victory at the time would have been terrible for Ukraine, but would not have been an existential defeat for the West. Now, however, after the US and allies pumped hundreds of billions of pounds into the war, made political commitments to stand with Ukraine as long as it takes, and at the time when Russia describes its war as a war against the collective West, when tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have been killed by American weapons. Even if some people in Washington say this is not our war, it is seen as an American war around the world, in places where it really matters for the US. And a Russian victory in Ukraine now would be seen as an American defeat in East Asia, in the Middle East, and would really make America's position untenable in those other areas where people that oppose aid to Ukraine say they care about, like Taiwan. And so that is I think, not necessarily often understood in Washington, where people look at different geographies and don't understand that it is now there's a risk of, on one hand, the American-led alliance is fracturing, because it's hard to see how NATO could survive Russia taking over Ukraine as a result of an American betrayal, if you will. And on the other hand, you see America's rivals, or the rivals of the Western democracies in a way, who were not on the same page until now, coalescing. So you have a military alliance of Russia, North Korea, North Korea, and Iran now, with them supplying Russia with key ammunition, drones from Iran, and the Russian offensive now is basically fueled by North Korean artillery shells, and Russia in reverse starting to supply them with high-tech military technologies and weapons that were denied to them in the past, that could really endanger Japan, South Korea, and Iran's many enemies in the Middle East. And now to Trump, I'm not. It's very ungrateful business to be predicting what Trump will do and say. He has said, however, that he has a peace plan that he hasn't explained, and that if Russia rejects his peace plan, he will double up on aid to Ukraine. So, if we look at history, President Obama had refused to provide Ukraine with any military aid when he was in office. He famously said that there's nothing that America can do that would ever prevent Russia from controlling Ukraine. So he kind of washed his hands and walked away. President Trump did provide Ukraine for the first time with American weapons. Small numbers, but still he broke that taboo. So I think the Ukrainians hope, and what other choice do they have, is that if Trump comes back to the White House, his administration will realize the danger to America's national interests that lie in abandoning Ukraine.
You mentioned a proposed, I guess, this is all reliant on November this year, but the proposed sort of peace talks, but just exploring peace talks somewhat. I'm interested in this because having interviewed certainly a senior American general, David Petraeus, regarding militarily Ukraine taking back the land that's been lost, their sovereign territory after all. Militarily, he was saying that it's very difficult, and he said it in such a way that it made it sound like he meant it. He didn't use the word impossible, but it wasn't a million miles away from that. But at the same time, I've spoken with Serhiy Plokhy, I'm sure you're aware of, who gave a very vociferous defense of Ukraine looking to secure its territorial integrity and asking the question, would any other Western country accept land that's been taken by an aggressor and just take it on the chin and in peace talks? So I just wondered, how realistic are peace talks with Russia, and whether Ukraine would have to surrender land that is going to prove very difficult to take back militarily?
I think let's look first at where the positions are right now. Okay, Ukraine and the international community say that all of Ukraine is in its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea and the parts of Donbass taken in 2014, are Ukrainian, should belong to Ukraine. This is what pretty much the entire world believes, with the exception of, I think, Syria and North Korea. Even Belarus, Russia's closest ally, has not recognized the annexation of Crimea formally. What does Russia say? Russia has carried out these illegal referendums in the autumn of 2022, annexing 4 Ukrainian regions, in which it doesn't control the capitals of 2 and doesn't control large chunks of another 2. Actually, in one of these regions, when it had a referendum, most voters were actually living on territory controlled by Ukraine and didn't take part in it. And now under Russian law, all the fighting now is occurring on sovereign Russian soil. Accepting the status quo right now under Russian law, as ridiculous as it sounds, would mean accepting the occupation by Ukraine of big Russian cities, some of which were never under Russian rule, like Zaporizhzhia. And so it's hard to imagine Putin accepting this now, also because it would be unconstitutional under Russian law. And the Russians are very clear what the goals are. The goals are not Donbass. The goals are not Crimea. The goals are all of Ukraine. Putin himself said that Odessa is a Russian city just weeks ago. Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president, who's still the head of the ruling party, said that any Ukrainian state, no matter how friendly to Russia, is a mortal danger to all Ukrainians because it's unacceptable. And Ukrainians have a choice to die or to become Russians. So can it be any more clear than that? So it's kind of hard to have peace talks if the goal of the other side is to exterminate you.
We're in for a much longer conflict, really, ultimately.
Oh yes, I don't, definitely, it's very unlikely that there will be any moves to resolve it this year, barring some major frontline development. And I spoke before about the this being the battle of the resilience of the two societies. And if Russia's society cracks from within, then the front lines can also crack, and the Ukrainians can move ahead. This is what happened in World War One. All of a sudden, the Russian Empire cracked, and there were German troops in Kiev.
Well, we saw that with the Prigozhin Wagner mutiny. I mean, it did seem to show that the division or brigade, I forget how large it was, the force that Prigozhin was taking to Moscow, but wasn't that far away from Moscow when he turned away. I think everyone in the West is sort of hoping that Putin falls, and then we have a nice Western-friendly leader takes over, and the war in Ukraine ends, and life can get better. Now, that's an extremely rosy view of what could happen. We assume that if Putin is overthrown, that whoever takes over will be better for the West. But that's an assumption that is a big one, isn't it?
Well, let's look at Prigozhin, first of all. Prigozhin was a war criminal, a horrible personality from all accounts. A criminal, full stop. He spent 10 years in the Soviet prison for armed robbery and assault. And yet, after fighting in Ukraine, he came to the conclusion that the war was launched under false pretenses and that it was really unjust. And he sort of wanted an end to it in some ways. And I think no matter who comes after Putin, no matter what their ideology is, they will not own this war. Their future will not be linked to the continuation of this war. And they will have all the interest in the world to say, mistakes were made, and walk away from this one way or another. Something that Putin cannot do. So as long as Putin is in office, war is probably likely to continue, because to him, settling is more dangerous than continuing, as long as he can still promise victory somewhere down the line.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's this view that there's almost a sort of limitless supply of men for the Russians. But if one looks at the war in Afghanistan, which lasted 10 years, and with the Soviets losing, I think, around 15,000 men over that 10-year period, which, I think, I don't know what the rough numbers are Russian killed, but it's over 100,000, I think it's estimated at.
Could be, yeah. And also it's a country that is half as big.
Exactly, yes, exactly. Fewer of the republics to draw on. And the war in Afghanistan had a massive impact on the Soviet Union. So the idea that there are sort of an unlimited supply, the losses are going to have a genuine impact on the Russian state and the people. And how likely do you think it is that we will get a change?
I think these are very different wars. First of all, the war in Afghanistan was really limited. I mean, at no point did the Russian contingent there exceed 100,000 troops. It was an expeditionary war that was seen by many as optional, and it came at a time when the Soviet system was just fracturing from within because of economic inefficiencies, because of all the ethnic issues that had been bubbling up, and the whole idea, sort of the communist idea, was by then completely discredited. So Afghanistan really contributed to existing internal pressures, and in fact, and also the opposition to it was made possible by this existing internal dissent. This war is completely different. First of all, I think Putin has been very successful by creating this cult of World War II victory. This is like really the new religion of Russia. Is we beat the Nazis, we saved humanity, and kind of portraying this as the next act of the same struggle. And that's why he's labeling Ukrainians as Nazis, and that's why so many Russians believe in it. And I think he has succeeded in convincing a great many Russians that this is an existential war for Russia. Also because a great many Russians don't believe that Ukraine should exist. Let's not forget, this is not an outlier opinion in Russia. Even the greatest Soviet Russian dissidents thought the same. Joseph Brodsky, who was exiled and who was the US poet laureate, famously wrote a poem on Ukraine's independence saying, "I wish to spit into the Dnieper River and hope it flows backwards because it's ungrateful." And then he used a slur word for Ukrainians, have dared to abandon us. And so, Kiev is seen as the mother of Russian cities in the Russian mythos, national mythos. And so that's why it has a lot more support than the war for Afghanistan that nobody really cared about that much. And also he has an escape valve. People who are not happy can leave. And hundreds of thousands left after this mobilization began. And so there's hardly any critics left inside Russia to oppose this and to put sort of political pressure on the government over the war.
Yeah, but Navalny, who's in jail, but I think he doesn't think Ukraine should exist either, does he?
Well, Navalny, no. Navalny changed his rhetoric quite a bit. Navalny was a Russian nationalist in the beginning. And he famously said when Crimea was annexed that Crimea is not a sandwich. You cannot give it back. But in his statements from prison, he has condemned the invasion and he's supported the Ukrainian resistance. But the whole sort of Navalny opposition was an opposition premised on the idea that elections and a peaceful resistance within Russia has a future. Obviously, he's in prison and it has no future. And the regime has very successfully destroyed all of that. And yes, there are Russians who are opposed to the regime, but many of them actually go to Ukraine and pick up rifles in Ukraine and fight the Russian government as part of the Russian volunteer units inside the Ukrainian army or affiliated with the Ukrainian army.
So what's next for you? Will you be returning to Ukraine to carry on reporting there?
Yes, for sure. And Ukraine and also the impact of this war around the world, because sort of we're now at the time of this, when all these wars and crises are increasingly connected with each other. And what happens in one theater affects the other.
Yes. Now with China and Taiwan, that's now looking increasingly dangerous. So that's an interesting point you make about everything being interlinked. This, I guess, is almost unprecedented since, well, I guess Second World War, obviously everything, it was a global conflict, but we're looking at extremely dangerous times then, would you say, in the first time since the fall of the wall?
For sure. And we are now in the age of an increasingly globalized conflict in which this sort of axis of authoritarian regimes are working increasingly together to undermine the Western-led democratic order and to discredit it and to challenge it. And, we're seeing, what is happening with the Houthis now, for example, challenging global trade in the Red Sea.
There are plenty of strong voices in the West as well, looking to undermine Western democracy and values. I guess the argument be that that's a veneer and it's really imperialism and colonialism in another guise at the moment, the West.
Yeah, I think the problem generally with the world is a lot of people are looking at reality through the prism of the existing ideological preconditions. And so, when they look at the war in Ukraine, they're like, well, America bad, colonialism, imperialism. So, then Russia good, and Ukrainians don't have any agencies. It's all NATO's fault, they're pawns. And it's a profoundly dehumanizing discourse. We're seeing the same in the Middle East, where, for the opposite reasons, people are dehumanizing Palestinians. And geopolitics is great, and it's good to understand your sort of framework. But I see it's very much all too often sort of like football, when you root for your team, no matter what they do, without actually looking at what they're doing.
Well, Yaroslav, this has been a really interesting chat, and I wish you all the best with your book, Our Enemies Will Vanish. And so thank you.
Thank you. Great to be on this podcast.
Thanks so much for listening. I do hope that isn't too downbeat for you. Coming up, we'll talk Napoleon and plenty more great history to come on the pod. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.